Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's lecture organized by UK Talim Department. As per our tradition, we will start the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran. Can I request Umar Shirwani Sahib to deliver the tilawat and its translation, please? Jazakallah.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. Translation. I seek refuge with Allah from Satan the accursed. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the ever merciful. Surely all believers are brothers. So make peace between brothers, and fear Allah that mercy may be shown to you. O ye who believe, let not one people deride another people, who may be better than they, nor let women deride other women, who may be better than they. And defame not your own people, nor call one another by nicknames. Bad indeed is evil reputation after the profession of belief, and those who repent not are the wrongdoers. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah for your tilawat, Jazakallah. So now tonight we have we have the pleasure of joined by Fazal Ahmad Sahib. Fazal Sahib has the experience in the Humanity First. He's been with the Humanity First for a couple of decades. He's also the editor of Comparative Religions on the Review of Religious magazine, has been serving the editorial team since 1993. As always, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. These will put to our guest on your behalf. And in the last 15 minutes, please type your questions into the live chat and kindly ensure they are relevant to tonight's topic. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Fazal Ahmad Sahib to deliver the lecture.
Jazakallah. Can you hear me? Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Let me share my screen. I've got a few slides. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the topic I was going to cover tonight is African traditional religions. So we all know of Islam and Christianity in Africa, but what about their religious experiences before that and their relationship with their creator before that? And that's what I mean by traditional religions. I've been fortunate to be able to serve in the Review of Religions for almost 30 years. And it's that work and the closeness in the early days with Khalifa Rabi and his guidance that has inspired my interest in this and many related subjects. So I just wanted to start with the Review of Religions itself. And the reason for me that it's such an amazing magazine is that it was started by the Promised Messiah in 1902. And many of the articles in the first 5 or 6 years were penned by the Promised Messiah al-Islam himself. And its reason was to explore comparative religions. Now, the Review of Religions has been going for 120 years. And many of you, most of you will have experienced it through the print edition. But actually, we also have the website and we have social media. And on the website, we have many, many more articles than we could ever fit into the print edition. So it's always worth checking to see what the latest articles are on the website. And similarly on social media, we often have daily updates with videos and interviews and other presentations of similar content. So it's a very rich content source across all of the platforms. And we've had articles on comparative religion and even African traditional religions going back decades. So you should, after this call, at some point, go and have a look at the website, go and look us up on social media, and you'll see just how much is there. And if you've been tracking the review recently, you may have seen we've started our Existence project, and this is just one of several that are going to become feature programs in the Review of Religions. So this is where my interest was sparked. Let's look at Africa. So Africa is a continent, not a country as some people like to think of it. And it has a vast array of cultures, tribes, peoples, and even faiths across the region. And it's had contact with much of the rest of the world. We're going to explore that later. Africa now has a population of 1.3 billion, and they're largely youngsters, unlike in Europe or North America. So the average age is under 20 in Africa, which actually shows the huge potential that they have. And I'm fortunate to visit most years, and I can see many parts of Africa developing. But Africa also has a very, very rich and ancient history. So if you go across Africa, you'll find that there are 800 key languages across the many countries, but there are sometimes over 3,000 dialects. If you look at the way Africa's populations are structured, they roughly fall into 6 tribal groupings who then spread out and diversified. And even, if you look at the top of Africa, I don't know if you can see this area is the Sahara Desert area, but actually, if you went back 12,000 years after the Ice Age, the Sahara was fertile. And it was fertile for probably another 7,000 to 8,000 years. It was only after that that the Sahara started to become desertified. So there were a lot of people, there was a lot of culture in this area, which we're now starting to discover through caves and other remnants. But there were other early civilizations. So, long before Christianity, there were big, civilizations in Mauritania, which is on the western coast. That was around 2000 BC. There were civilizations in Ethiopia that are linked to Solomon and Judaism from 1000 BC. Nigeria had an active culture from 1500 BC. So these are old traditional civilizations in their own right. And Christianity and Islam came into the continent relatively recently, so from 300 to 1900 in the current era. So there's a lot to explore. And when we look at that continent, you wonder, many of the religions that we know of, the prophets that we know of, the 24 plus prophets that are named in the Quran, they largely relate to the Middle East. So were there not prophets in Africa? And was there not revelation in Africa? And that's what we're going to explore this evening. And just to reinforce that, in the Quran, there are 3 or 4 verses that talk about the way God sent messengers to all peoples. Here's one from chapter 16, verse 37, which says, "And we did raise among every people, a messenger, preaching worship Allah and shun the evil one. Then among them were some whom Allah guided, and among them were some who became deserving of ruin." At the same time, in the Hadith, this is a less well regarded or not as authentic Hadith in the Musnad Imam Ahmad. But in that, the Prophet was asked about how many other prophets had been sent to mankind, and he answered 124,000. So when we look at the prophets that we know of, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. And some of those would have been in Africa as well. Even if you look at the history of humankind, in Africa, a lot of the focus is on the northeast in Egypt. And it's only when you get to after Christianity that you start to see developments in places like Ethiopia. But there were definitely cultures in Africa much before that. And this is clearly worthy of much greater research. So we need to fill those gaps and see what were the cultures in other parts of Africa beyond Egypt? When were they from? And are there any signs amongst those people of a spiritual interaction? If we look at the 2 big faiths of Africa, Christianity and Islam, first of all, let's look at Christianity. Now, soon after Christianity emerged, it very quickly had a stronghold in North Africa, in Carthage and Alexandria, which became 2 of the big early 5 centers of Christianity. And a lot of the early debate about whether Jesus was a god or a human or something in between was happening in places like Tunisia, modern Tunisia. But not long after that, Ethiopia became probably one of the first countries in the world to adopt Christianity as its faith at the beginning of the 4th century. So Christianity came into Africa from Egypt and the northeast region and spread across North Africa and down to the Horn of Africa through Sudan and Ethiopia. Centuries later, it was traders from Europe who brought Christianity to the West African coastline, then to places like Angola and Congo through the Portuguese, and South Africa through the British and Dutch, and equally into modern East Africa through British expansion. So this is how Christianity came into Africa. And it's useful to understand this because when you now look at the regions of Africa which are largely Christian, which is in the south and parts of West Africa and East Africa, you can now see why, because that's where Christianity was introduced. On the bottom right, you can see one of the early churches of Ethiopia. This is actually Lalibela, and this is carved out of the rocks, out of the ground. But Christianity became very strong in places like Egypt, where the Coptic church was established, and Ethiopia, which became a bedrock of Christianity. And even for, we all know the story of in the early years of Islam, when the Muslims had to flee persecution, they went to Abyssinia. That is in modern Ethiopia. And that's where the Christian communities were by now very well established for the last 250, 300 years. So this was the expansion of Christianity into Africa. Now, if we look at Islam, Islam followed soon after, and at the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, first Muslims fled to Ethiopia for sanctuary, and then the Holy Prophet ﷺ sent dignitaries and emissaries to various regions, including to Egypt and Libya and the North African region, but also to Ethiopia and Sudan and the major cultures of that time. So Islam came into Africa in the 7th century, and over that period started to spread and gain a foothold, particularly in the northern countries. But then from the north, the Muslims began to take Islam into West Africa through initially Mauritania. And what you can see is that actually at that time, there was a massive empire there, the Songhai Empire, which was hugely advanced culture in West Africa at that time. And it would soon be replaced by the Malian Empire. But so the Muslims very quickly encountered quite advanced and developed African society and African culture. And from there, Islam spread to much of modern West Africa as well. Meanwhile, Arab and Asian traders came in by sea with their goods and started to trade from the Horn of Africa down to Kenya, then Tanzania, Mozambique, and that whole region. And that happened between the 9th and 12th centuries. So this is why you now see the concentrations of Islam in the northern and western parts of Africa and some parts of Eastern Africa, but less so in Central and Southern Africa. So this is why Christianity and Islam coexist in the way that they do. And on the bottom right, you can actually see one of the early mosques of northern Ghana. And this was the style of mosques that people from the Malian Empire introduced. And for those of you who know Timbuktu or Jenne, this is the style that they were adopting. But it was not just Christianity and Islam, and it wasn't just interactions coming into Africa. Africa also began to get exposure to other parts of the world. So in the Muslim world, Al-Andalus in Spain was a fountain of culture and architecture and development, and people will have heard of Alhambra and some of the great developments in Al-Andalus. Well, the people that went first to establish Al-Andalus in the 8th century went from North Africa. And many African people went in waves, into Al-Andalus in the centuries after. And the artisans and craftsmen went from Africa and took their skills. And the architecture that we see in Spain today is because of them. But actually, if you were to look at architecture in Seville, in Cordoba, in Granada, the origins of that are actually in places like Algeria and Morocco. And if you go and visit places like Marrakesh, you'll start to really understand how that architecture that we now see as Spanish actually fit in Muslim cultures in Northwest Africa. It would surprise you also that the Malians, I talked about the great Mali Empire, which was in West Africa here. The Malians actually sailed to the Americas around 1300, 200 years before Columbus went to the Americas. And there's even evidence now of African artifacts dating back almost 2,000 years. So there's new research going on as to how that happened and whether African communities managed to sail across to South America centuries before that. But equally, if we look on to the east, you can see that many African traders went to India and China. And even today, in many parts of India, like Hyderabad and Gujarat, there are African communities who are now called Sidi, but they're from the Bantu tribes of East Africa, and they still hold some of their old customs and traditions, even though they now speak Hindi, but they're clearly African origin people. Africa also had contact with China and Indonesia. Again, they went as far as China to do trade, but the Indonesians came to Madagascar as part of what became known as the Austronesian Empire. And there's also, through the unfortunate movement of Africans through slave trade, there are communities in Brazil and Haiti and Cuba who still have a huge influence from traditional African beliefs. So Africa had interactions with many continents and many parts of the world, and that informed the thinking that they had on the continent of spirituality, religion, culture. Many people assume that Africa was isolated, but it wasn't. And indeed, if you have a look across Africa and look at the various tribes that exist and the religious sites that there are, they are covering across all of Africa, not just places like Egypt and Morocco. As you head further south to West Africa or Southern Africa or Central Eastern Africa, you find caves, you find temples, you find sacred hills and lakes, you find ancient settlements and cities which were very, very advanced for their time. On the top left, you can see Great Zimbabwe. On the top right, as we mentioned, we have Lalibela from Ethiopia. You have the Yoruba cultures from Ife in Nigeria. You have Jenne and Timbuktu on the bottom center in modern Mali. Bottom left, again, this is from Aksum in Ethiopia, which goes back over 2,000 years. So there is a lot to explore in Africa. The people had a rich culture. It wasn't just the architecture, it was their religious beliefs, which we're going to have a look at now. And they must have had prophets. And now we have teams, I've got 11, 12 people now in Africa doing research, looking at these tribes, at their history, and looking for evidence for spiritual activity of those early tribes. Unlike Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, some of the major world religions, there are no religious texts that we can turn to understand the origins of African spirituality. What we do have is oral tradition. And most of that oral tradition has eventually become mythology. But those traditions are there and they're actually quite strong. And we're going to look at some examples now under different headings. So there are traditions, there are folk songs, there are stories to do with creation, to do with life after death and the underworld and spirit worlds, to do with the great flood, to do with the Day of Judgment, to do with ancestors and heroes, historical events, nature and the environment. So given that we don't have written texts, if we can explore the mythology and the oral traditions and look at where there are consistencies and commonalities across tribes, does that mythology become a kind of scripture that we can work from? There are many African scholars themselves who have started to research their history and their culture. And, like the Black Lives Matter movement last year, those people of an African origin in other parts of the world are now also wondering about their cultural background and their cultural heritage. This is just one of the African scholars. This is Jacob Olupona. He's originally from Nigeria. He's now a very esteemed professor of indigenous African religions in Harvard University in the USA. And he's describing how African traditional religions are not something that were on one side and daily life was on the other. They were an integral part of daily life in Africa. And he's just given one example here, that when people became sick, their worldview was that not only was it a physical body, imbalance of the body, so a physical ailment causing the sickness, but also an imbalance of someone's social life, their family relationships, their relationships with their ancestors, their respect for their culture. So all of these things were felt to be essential to be a healthy person in Africa. And an imbalance of any of those would lead to a person's health breaking down. And this is just one example of how in Africa they see the universe and nature and spirituality all as part of the same continuum, not as religion is one separate entity and then we ignore that when we go into our daily work. No, for them, this whole continuum is part of their daily consciousness. So let's look at some of the common themes that we see in Africa. First of all, there is a concept of a creator in Africa. And whichever name they give that creator and whatever other forms they might associate with that creator, there is an understanding that this is a superior being at a higher realm, not just limited to the earth, who also had a hand in the universe around us. And if you go around tribes, they might call this creator Ma, Erke, Ama, Olodumare, Angai, Erkukli. But the common facets of that creator are there. The creator can see everything. The creator is the benefactor who provides everything for us. And this is why in some cultures, such as in Nigeria, they would actually have lesser deities for the river, for mountains, for thunder, for the sun, for earth, because they see their creator in all of those. And those lesser deities in Nigeria would be known as Orisa. But these are almost like attributes. We would look at that more as attributes of God. They again associate that, but they would never say that Odudua or Ogun are at the same level. Olodumare is the creator at a much higher level than any of these. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you can see how they're describing God in proverbs, prayers, and songs in Africa. So they're describing how the creator is on high, whereas man is restricted to the earth. They're saying that God is in the heavens. They're also, now this is very profound. In the Akan proverb in Ghana, they say that God needs no pointing out to a child. And actually one thing we observe is that humans, as we get older, become distracted and start to become more worldly and misbehave, become arrogant, become more argumentative. Whereas as children. Children are more innocent. And in that proverb, they're describing that children can see God more easily, but they don't need to be told that there is a creator. Inherently, they know there is a creator, and it's that creator that they are seeking. Similarly, in the Yoruba tradition in Nigeria, nothing is hidden from him, whether it be in your home, out in the water, rest in the shade of a tree, or in the open. Here is your master. In other words, your Lord is everywhere where you can be, and also much above you. And the Igbo proverb, this is from northern Nigeria, that just as you would plan for your family and for other people, God plans for you. So this is coming back to the concept of God as the benefactor for all mankind. Then if we look at ancestors and spirits, now actually it's very easy to look at masks and the dances and costumes that people wear and the way they refer to their ancestors and spirits and think that they are talking about something strange. But actually, their understanding of ancestors and spirits is that they are intermediaries to God. And the most senior and the most distinguished are the ones that they would try and seek a communion with in order to communicate with their high God. That's actually not too dissimilar to the way we might view prophets as intermediaries who communicated with God and then gave that message to us. So maybe over time that's been eroded and jumbled, but actually maybe that's what they mean by ancestors. They're accessed through ceremonies using masks and statues and drumming and chanting, and sometimes they are using those ceremonies in order to heighten their spiritual state. But they also are using it to ward off the evil spirit or the trickster, as they often refer to this character across the tribes. An example of this kind of ritual was where in Benin, people would get themselves into a state in order to achieve communion with one of their ancestors known as Vodun. And this is the voodoo tradition that finally migrated to Haiti and has taken its own shape in Haiti, but this is where it comes from. If you look at social order, it's very evident that when you travel across Africa, and I've been fortunate to travel to quite a few countries for many years, wherever you go, there is a lot of respect and there is a definite social order and hierarchy. It's been my great privilege to experience across the continent that the people who have the least give the most. They will open their home to you as a visitor. All they have as food they will offer to you. Everything they have in their house is yours as their guest. And this comes from a deeper social order that is in Africa. So there is a tribal hierarchy. Even if I visit a tribe, before I can talk to ordinary tribe members, I must first visit the tribal chief and have an interaction with him and get his permission to enter his village and then talk to the rest of the community. So they have a respect for their chief, for their elders, for parents, for teachers, for ancestors. Teachers is interesting because in Europe and North America, we sometimes struggle to get our children to go to school or to value what they're getting. Whereas in Africa, they all value their teachers as their parents, and they value education as their route out of poverty. But this is nothing new. This has been there from many, many centuries. Similarly, not just the social order in terms of other humans, they respect the environment around them. They respect nature. They respect the rivers and the mountains, and they try and keep harmony with the nature around them. So, there are many, many proverbs in this area. I've just picked one from Ghana, where if your parents take care of you up to the time you cut your teeth, you take care of them when they lose theirs. And this is evident all across Africa, this respect for parents and looking after them into their old age. Related to that then is a moral code. So there is a great feeling of the need for honesty and trust wherever you go. Respect based on, as we looked at just now, respect for people based on their social status. Appropriate dress, and they would have different dress for people who take on a higher role in society. Kindness and generosity, treatment of guests and travelers, as I just explained. And the golden rule is prevalent in Africa just as it is in other parts of the world. The treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. And this, again, is shown in many of the proverbs that are held in Africa. So Yoruba proverb from Nigeria, one going to take a pointed stick to pinch a baby bird should first try it on himself to feel how it hurts. So this is that golden rule in action. Treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. Similarly from Kenya in the Kipsigis proverb, it's humility that exalts one and favors him against his friends. So humility, generosity, kindness, honesty, respect, all of these facets that we value are there and have been there for many, many centuries in Africa. And it's evident village after village, town after town, country after country across the continent. And then the afterlife. So they often talk about the Day of Judgment. I mean, we know of the Day of Judgment and afterlife from the Egyptians. And actually, there was a period when it was the Sudanese who were the masters in Egypt and the pharaohs, and the Sudanese introduced pyramids into Egypt. So those concepts came from slightly further south in Egypt. But that Day of Judgment is there in many, many cultures. The fact that at that time, all of your deeds are laid bare, whether visible or hidden. The concept of heaven and hell based on your behavior in this world. The idea that there's a greater purpose for men and women beyond just this life on earth. And we already discussed that the Creator is beyond this planet. Similarly, they had an understanding that life was more than just hunting and eating. And you see that when you visit tribes, that they're not worldly at all. As I said, they would open their homes to a visitor, but even to each other, by and large, they are not worldly people. Their objective is not hoarding possessions. So here's an example from Benin, a Fon song, which says, "At the gates of the land of the dead, you will pass before a searching judge. His justice is true, and he will examine your feet. He will know how to find every stain, whether visible or hidden under the skin. If you have fallen on the way, in other words, if you have sinned, he will know. If the judge finds no stains on your feet, in other words, if you've lived a moral life, open your belly to joy, for you have overcome and your belly is clean." This is just one example of a commentary around the Day of Judgment and atonement. Similarly, in Nigeria, there's an Igbo song, which says, "We are on a market trip to earth. Whether we fill our baskets or not, once the time is up, we go home." So this is, again, calling out the fact that the purpose of your creation is not to just to hoard worldly possessions and to gain power. There is something beyond this life, and that's what we should gear ourselves towards. So these concepts are all there in Africa. So in conclusion, we'll open it up to questions. I'm happy to answer any questions. What we do see in Africa is a split roughly 40% Muslim, 40% Christian, 20% traditional African faiths across the continent. But there are scholars. My wife has actually studied this a lot more than I have. They talk about syncretism of religions borrowing from each other to enhance certain characteristics. So this is something from Burkina Faso. The Burkinabe would say, we are 50% Christian, we are 50% Muslim, and 100% animist. In other words, they've borrowed from all of the traditions that they find, and they have their own adaptation, which takes the best of all of the traditions that they find. So whereas Islam and Christianity entered the continent up to, say, 1500 years ago, there were many other traditions and spiritual experiences in the continent which shape the tribes and their behavior that we see today. Although much of Africa's religion is a mixture, a syncretism of traditional and world faiths, those traditional beliefs were very, very strong. And we don't have written proof, we don't have texts like the Quran, but we do have oral tradition. And when you start to explore and talk to tribal chiefs, you're starting to find traces of those messengers, of their impact. And this needs much greater research and needs to be shown more respect. And just to finish off, the review has a rich source of resource for you. It's not just the print, but the online and social media. You can see I've shown some examples of articles on the right-hand side related to this subject. If you want to look at how the Africans traveled to South America 200 years before Columbus, that's the book at the bottom by Ivan van Sertima. And there are many, many articles, if you go through the review back catalogue, which are looking at not just Islam and Christianity in Africa, but those traditional faiths and the values and what impact they've left on that society. So I'll stop there.
Right, Jazakallah, Fazal Ahmad Sahib, for such a comprehensive lecture on the African traditional religions. I'm certain this must have provided us, our viewers, the information of the facts of such richness of history. This abundance of culture, values, and religious beliefs are astonishing. And I have no doubt there's a lot to learn for us in such a developed society. Now, I will pass on to Waqar Ahmadi Sahib to take the Q&A segment.
Jazakumullah. I think doing more compliments than questions this evening. Mashallah, a lot of our viewers full of praise for the quality of the lecture from Dallas to Nigeria. So mashallah, we've got a worldwide audience with us this morning, or this evening, I should say, depending where you are in the world, obviously. So we have a question from Tayed Mahmood Sahib, who asks, are there African traditions anticipating a future savior similar to the promised Messiah, salam? And what about the latter days?
Yes, there are. It needs more research because there are concepts of a future savior and a Messiah, a redeemer in most parts of the world. However, because of Christianity and Islam coming in as well, some of those concepts have now borrowed from Christianity and Islam and become a kind of hybrid. So more research is needed to go into those traditional beliefs and really get to the bottom of that. But those concepts are definitely there. What you do find is when you visit these tribes, initially they are quite suspicious and hesitant to share information with you because there's centuries of abuse and misuse of African tribes, and so they hold their traditions very close to their chest. But as you become respected and show respect for them, they then start to open up. And what you find is things that you thought seemed quite strange make perfect sense in their eyes. And when they explain it in their words, then it suddenly makes sense. And I am sure that as we get closer and closer to those people, we will find those concepts. So as I mentioned, we've got teams actively doing this research now in places like Zimbabwe, Ghana, Nigeria, and other parts of Africa. And inshallah, the more, this is going to be many years of research, but the more time we spend in those regions, the more we will start to uncover their original and true concepts.
Jazakallah. Shazad Kesser Sahib asked a question. I think it's just touching on what you just mentioned just now in relation to things like abuse. But his question is, I'm trying to read into the question. I think it's trying to find an explanation for why, on the one hand, we see that the African continent is quite strong in terms of family values and also is very proud of its religious history. But we also see that it's a continent full of conflicts, wars, and worse. And he's looking for some further expansion on that. So can you maybe account for why there seems to be that contradictory feature of the African continent, which isn't obviously exclusive to Africa, but I think his question is more specific.
Well, I think many of your viewers were hail from the South Asian continent, and you could say the same there now, couldn't you? You could say the Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs seem to be at loggerheads with each other. And if you look at what happened in the partition, it was one of the worst episodes in history. Yet, if you went back 300, 400 years earlier than that, you found all of those cultures for centuries living in harmony with each other. So what changed? And it's the same in Africa. Yes, there were conflicts. Empires grew up, and empires don't just grow up by growing corn and tomatoes. So empires grew, they expanded, but at the same time, there was a different respect and there was a different culture in Africa. However, as outside cultures came in, and their interest was not cultural, their interest was not religious, their interest was in natural resources. And suddenly tribes were set against each other. And when those tribes learned the value of salt, the value of gold, the value of other raw materials, they got sucked into the same behavior. It was African tribes themselves after that who started to offer up rival tribes as slaves. They became complicit in the slave trade. But these things all came about after they saw the outside influence and the disproportionate value being assigned to gold and other commodities that are richly found in Africa. And the same thing we see today. China is coming in big time into Africa. America is now trying to retrench in Africa. The European nations are trying to find their place back in Africa. I don't think their main motivation is for the spiritual enhancement of the people there. Suddenly you find motorways springing up in the middle of nowhere in Africa. It's only because they found a gold mine. That's the reason that you now have conflicts and wars, and have had for the last 200 or 300 years.
Obviously, the focus of the talk tonight has been on looking at Africa specifically. And you also talked about the excellent work that's ongoing with the Review of Religions as well. Presumably, will we find similar signposts in other parts of the world, as you just touched upon with Africa today?
Yes, of course we will. We're looking at a broader program in the review. I'm not going to mention it yet because we're going to be launching it in a few months' time. But yes, we're doing exactly the same in Latin America and Central America. We're doing the same in parts of Europe, across the Middle East and Asia and Australasia, exactly the same. God sent prophets to every tribe. So wherever they existed, God sent messengers. And this is a quest that we should all have and to seek knowledge. There's that saying, seek knowledge even if to China. Well, we should definitely do that. And the reason Africa is interesting is that for many centuries, Africa, they say history is written by the conquerors. So Africa has become a backwater. It had no history. It had no culture. It had no traditions. It had no empires. It had no architecture. But actually, the truth is totally different. And now people are starting to realize that. And even I have many friends in North America who are trying to reclaim their heritage and visiting Africa and seeing for themselves where they came from. And the more they research and they understand the rich culture that existed in Africa long before, it's giving them a sense of pride and a sense of belief and a sense of purpose as well. So we will see more research in this area, inshallah.
Inshallah. We have another question from Tayyib Mahmood Sahib, who asked, have there been attempts to trace the geographical origin of traditions based on relative distances and similarities, etc.?
I think I understand what he's asking. Yes, if you, as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 or 6 big groupings that the tribes came from. And so, like the Bantu tribes. So those tribes then spread out and sometimes came across other big tribal entities, and there was some cross-pollination of ideas. If you look at Zimbabwe, that's a very good example, because Zimbabwe, on the one hand, had its own culture in the south from the Zulu lands and just north of that. But at the same time, the big developments came when the Bantu tribes from the north, from the Horn of Africa, came south and entered Zimbabwe from the north. And it was the meeting of those tribes that saw a big development and eventually the rise of Great Zimbabwe. So yes, we can. The more research we do, we are starting to peel back that history and see the commonalities across tribes and where the main, and you can see it also from language. So the languages are also related to each other. And there might be 800 languages, but they boil down to 6 or 7 main family groupings. And I'm sure if you take it further back, you would find some Arabic roots as well, but that's for another day.
Inshallah, I think that leads nice on to another invitation to you in the future to come back and share your insights and obviously very extensive knowledge, mashallah. So that's all we have time for, unfortunately, this evening. It's been a fascinating insight into the history of religion in Africa. And obviously, as you've intimated, that the story goes on. And inshallah, we look forward to hearing more in the next sort of months and years, inshallah. Just to remind viewers that our lectures return next week. This will now be at the new time of 7:15 p.m. So we have our next Urdu lecture on Monday, the 15th of March. And that will be on the topic of the importance of Tehreek-e-Jadid by Dr. Tariq Anwar Badr Sahib. And that will be followed by our next English lecture a week today by Murabbi al-Silsila Humayun Jahangir Khan Sahib on the topic Who are Dajjal, Gog and Magog. So please join us for both of those lectures at the new time of 7:15 p.m. next week. If I could please request respected Fazal Sahib to lead us in silent prayer.
Please join me. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakumullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.